The evening air in Denver carried the scent of autumn leaves and distant rain clouds, painting the city in hues of amber and gold as streetlights flickered to life across the downtown district. It was October 1989, and the world seemed smaller then, wrapped in the comfortable certainty that some things could be trusted without question. A raised hand could summon safety, a phone call could bring help. A taxi meant protection from the darkness that crept between buildings as night fell over the mile-high city. But trust, as so many would learn in the weeks that followed, could be a fragile thing. The case that would haunt Denver's investigators for decades began not with violence or chaos, but with something far more unsettling in its simplicity. It started with a young woman making what should have been the most ordinary decision in the world. A decision that thousands of people made every single day without consequence or fear. She needed to get home, and she called for help. Her name was Evelyn Thorne, and at 24, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to navigate the world on her own terms. Friends described her as thoughtful, the kind of person who remembered birthdays and always had time to listen when life became overwhelming. She had moved to Denver 3 years earlier from a small farming community outside the city, drawn by the promise of opportunity and the chance to build something entirely her own. Evelyn worked as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm downtown, a job that suited her methodical nature and love of order. Numbers made sense to her in ways that people sometimes didn't. They followed rules, created patterns, told stories that could be trusted. Her colleagues knew her as reliable, someone who stayed late to ensure everything balanced perfectly, who took pride in work that others might find mundane. On weekday evenings, she would often walk the 16 blocks from her office to her apartment, enjoying the rhythm of the city around her. Denver in 1989 was experiencing a period of growth and change, with new businesses opening alongside establishments that had served the community for generations. The downtown area buzzed with an energy that felt both cosmopolitan and authentically Western, a unique blend that had drawn so many young professionals like Evelyn to make the city their home. But October evenings brought shorter days and colder temperatures. And by the time Evelyn finished her work on that particular Thursday, rain was beginning to fall in steady sheets that turned the sidewalks into mirrors, reflecting neon signs and traffic lights. Walking home was no longer the peaceful transition between work and rest that she had come to cherish. Instead, it promised 16 blocks of cold discomfort and shoes that would need days to properly dry. The decision to call for a taxi was practical rather than dramatic. Evelyn was not someone given to unnecessary expense, but neither was she foolish about safety or comfort. She used the phone at her office to contact Yellow Cab Company, a service she had used several times before, without incident. The dispatcher told her a car would arrive within 15 minutes and would be waiting outside the Morrison building, where her office occupied a corner suite on the 4th floor. She gathered her belongings methodically, as was her nature. A brown leather purse that had been a gift from her mother, a canvas bag containing files she planned to review at home, an umbrella that had seen better days but still served its purpose, a light jacket that would prove insufficient for the evening's chill but was all she had available. These details, ordinary and forgettable in the moment, would later become crucial pieces of a puzzle that investigators would struggle to solve. Evelyn took the elevator to the ground floor and walked through the building's lobby, nodding to the security guard who had worked there for nearly a decade. Harold Brennan would later tell investigators that nothing seemed unusual about her departure. She appeared calm, unhurried, perhaps slightly annoyed by the weather, but otherwise entirely normal. He watched through the glass doors as she stepped onto the sidewalk and looked around for her ride. The rain had intensified, creating small rivers in the gutters and driving most pedestrians to seek shelter in nearby shops and restaurants. The few people who remained on the streets moved quickly, heads down, focused on reaching their destinations rather than observing the world around them. It was the kind of evening that made the city feel larger and more anonymous, where individuals became silhouettes moving through pools of light before disappearing again into shadow. According to the taxi company's records, car number 47 had been dispatched to pick up a fare at the Morrison building. The driver, a man named Thomas Caldwell, had worked for Yellow Cab for just over 2 years and had an unremarkable record. A few minor traffic violations, one complaint about taking a longer route than necessary, but nothing that suggested any serious problems. He was supposed to arrive at 7:15 and transport his passenger to an address on Maple Street, about 3 miles from downtown. But Thomas Caldwell never made that pickup. At 7:20 that evening, he was involved in a minor fender bender on the other side of the city, an incident that would provide him with an unshakable alibi and create the first thread of mystery in what would become a case that defied easy explanation. If the official taxi never arrived, then what vehicle had Evelyn Thorne entered that night? The question would have remained purely theoretical, if not for Margaret Silver, who managed a small bookstore directly across the street from the Morrison building. Margaret had stayed late that evening to complete inventory, a tedious but necessary task that she typically reserved for quiet weeknight hours when customers were unlikely to interrupt her work. The bookstore's large front windows provided a clear view of the street, and Margaret had developed the habit of glancing up from her work periodically to observe the small dramas of urban life unfolding outside. She noticed Evelyn immediately, recognizing her as someone who occasionally browsed the mystery and biography sections during lunch breaks. The young woman stood near the curb, clearly waiting for something, checking her watch with the slightly impatient expression of someone whose schedule was being disrupted by circumstances beyond her control. Margaret felt a pang of sympathy, remembering her own experiences with unreliable transportation during her younger years in the city. When a yellow sedan pulled up to the curb, Margaret initially thought nothing of it. The car appeared to be a taxi, though from her distance and through the rain-streaked window, she could not make out specific details about its markings or license plate. She watched as Evelyn approached the vehicle, bent slightly to speak to the driver through the passenger window, then moved around to enter through the rear door on the street side. What struck Margaret as odd, though she would not fully process the significance until much later, was how long this interaction seemed to take. In her experience, taxi pickups were typically swift and efficient. The passenger confirmed their identity, got in, stated their destination, and the car departed. But this exchange appeared more involved, as if there was some confusion or extended conversation taking place. The vehicle remained stationary for what Margaret estimated to be 2 or 3 minutes after Evelyn had gotten inside. Then, instead of pulling away from the curb in the normal fashion, it executed a U-turn and headed back in the direction from which it had come. This struck Margaret as unusual because the most direct route to the residential neighborhoods where young professionals typically lived would have required continuing straight or turning at the next intersection, not reversing direction entirely. By the time Margaret's attention returned to her inventory work and then back to the window, the street was empty, except for the steady rain and the occasional passing car. She thought no more about the incident until several days later, when missing person flyers began appearing throughout the downtown area, featuring a photograph of the young woman she had watched enter that questionable taxi. The missing person report was filed by Evelyn's landlord, Mrs. Dorothy Chen, who lived in the downstairs unit of the duplex that Evelyn rented on Maple Street. Mrs. Chen was a meticulous woman who paid attention to the rhythms and patterns of her small world. She knew that Evelyn typically arrived home between 6:30 and 7 o'clock on weekday evenings, that she would immediately turn on the radio in her kitchen while preparing dinner, and that she would spend an hour or two each evening reading in the living room with the curtains open and a single lamp providing warm light. When Friday evening passed without any sign of her upstairs tenant, Mrs. Chen initially assumed that Evelyn had made spontaneous plans with friends, or perhaps decided to work late on some project. Young people, she reasoned, were not always predictable in their routines. But when Saturday morning brought no evidence that Evelyn had returned home, and when her car remained in its designated parking space behind the building, Mrs. Chen's concern began to grow into genuine worry. She used her spare key to check Evelyn's apartment, calling out as she entered to ensure she was not intruding on her tenant's privacy. What she found was a space that appeared frozen in time, as if its occupant had simply vanished in the middle of an ordinary day. Mail sat unopened on the kitchen counter. A coffee cup, still containing cold liquid, waited beside the sink. A book lay open on the coffee table, a bookmark indicating that Evelyn had been halfway through a novel about archaeological discoveries in Egypt. Most telling of all, Evelyn's work clothes from Thursday were not among the items in her laundry basket, suggesting that she had never made it home to change after leaving the office. Mrs. Chen immediately contacted the police, beginning a process that would consume the attention of multiple investigators over the coming months. Detective Laura Hoffman was assigned to the case, a 15-year veteran of the Denver Police Department who specialized in missing persons investigations. She had seen enough cases to know that the first 48 hours were crucial, and she immediately began the systematic process of tracing Evelyn's last known movements. The accounting firm confirmed that she had left the office at her usual time. The taxi company's records showed that their dispatch car had never completed the pickup due to the traffic accident involving their driver. But Margaret Silver's testimony introduced a complication that transformed the case from a simple missing person investigation into something far more complex and troubling. If Evelyn had indeed entered a vehicle believing it to be her taxi, then someone had deliberately intercepted her, using the appearance of legitimate transportation to gain her trust and cooperation. The implications were deeply unsettling, suggesting a level of premeditation that made this far more than a crime of opportunity. Someone had known to be in that location at that time, either through pure chance or through information that should not have been accessible to the general public. The taxi company insisted that their dispatch communications were secure, but Detective Hoffman knew that radio frequencies could be monitored by anyone with the proper equipment and sufficient motivation. As word of the investigation spread through the community, other witnesses began to come forward with information that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of what might have happened that rainy October evening. A mechanic named Robert Hayes reported seeing a yellow sedan driving erratically through an industrial area on the north side of the city around 8 o'clock that night. The car had been moving slowly, as if the driver were unfamiliar with the area or searching for something specific. More troubling still was the testimony of Linda Morrison, a waitress at an all-night diner on the outskirts of the city. She remembered serving coffee to a man who had seemed nervous and agitated, frequently checking the parking lot through the restaurant's windows. When she glanced outside during a brief lull in customers, she noticed a yellow car parked at the far edge of the lot, positioned in a way that suggested the driver wanted to avoid the direct illumination of the streetlights. The man had left abruptly after receiving what appeared to be a phone call, paying his bill with exact change and walking quickly to the yellow vehicle. Linda had thought little of it at the time, but the details lingered in her memory because of how unusual the customer's behavior had been. People who stopped at her diner were typically either travelers seeking directions or local residents grabbing a late meal. This man had seemed to fit neither category, appearing instead to be using the location as some kind of way station or meeting point. These scattered pieces of testimony began to form the outline of a story that Detective Hoffman found deeply troubling. It suggested that Evelyn Thorne had not simply encountered a criminal by chance, but had been specifically targeted by someone who understood her routines well enough to intercept her at precisely the right moment. The level of planning and patience required for such a crime spoke to a perpetrator who was both organized and dangerous. As October gave way to November, the investigation expanded beyond the immediate circumstances of Evelyn's disappearance to examine broader patterns of criminal activity in the Denver area. What investigators discovered was a network of unlicensed taxi operators who had been working throughout the city for months, taking advantage of the legitimate company's busy periods to pick up unsuspecting fares. Most of these illegal operations were relatively harmless, if dishonest. Drivers would monitor taxi company radio frequencies, arrive at pickup locations before the official cars, and provide transportation for cash payments that avoided the company's fee structures. Passengers typically received the service they expected, even if they unknowingly paid the wrong person for it. But the existence of this shadow transportation network created opportunities for more serious crimes. Someone with malicious intent could easily blend into the ecosystem of unofficial taxis, using the same methods and appearance to gain access to vulnerable individuals who believed they were entering legitimate, regulated vehicles. The investigation revealed that at least 3 other women in the Denver area had reported strange experiences with taxi services over the past 6 months. In each case, they had called for rides that either never arrived or were provided by drivers who seemed unfamiliar with basic routes around the city. 2 of the women had chosen to exit the vehicles when they realized something was wrong. The third had been driven to her destination after an uncomfortably long route, but reported that the driver had asked numerous personal questions about her living situation and daily routines. Detective Hoffman began to wonder if Evelyn's case was part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior, one that had finally escalated from uncomfortable encounters to something far worse. The possibility that other potential victims might be at risk added urgency to an investigation that had already consumed countless hours and resources. As winter settled over Denver and the search for Evelyn Thorne continued, the case began to represent something larger than the disappearance of a single person. It became a symbol of the ways in which trust could be weaponized, how the simple systems that people relied upon for safety could be corrupted and turned against them. The yellow car that Margaret Silver had watched disappear into the rainy night remained somewhere in the city, along with whoever had been driving it and whatever had become of the young woman who had trusted it to carry her safely home. The silence that followed Evelyn Thorne's disappearance was not the peaceful quiet of resolution, but the heavy, suffocating stillness that accompanies unanswered questions. It settled over Denver like morning fog, touching everyone who had known her, and lingering long after the initial shock had faded into the dull ache of uncertainty. Her parents, Robert and Helen Thorne, drove into the city from their farm the morning after Mrs. Chen's call to the police. They were people of the land, accustomed to problems that could be solved through hard work and patience. Drought could be endured, equipment could be repaired, livestock could be nursed back to health. But their daughter's disappearance presented a challenge that no amount of determination seemed capable of addressing. Helen Thorne was a woman who had raised 4 children with a combination of practical wisdom and unwavering love. She had taught Evelyn to balance checkbooks and change tires, to stand up for herself and to trust her instincts. Now sitting in Detective Hoffman's office, she struggled to understand how all those lessons had failed to protect her daughter from whatever had happened on that rainy Thursday evening. Robert Thorne had worked the same land for 30 years, watching crops grow from seeds to harvest with the patience that comes from understanding natural rhythms. But there was no season for grief, no predictable cycle that could help him process the reality that his youngest child had simply vanished from the world. He found himself checking the phone every few minutes, convinced that Evelyn would call to explain some perfectly reasonable misunderstanding that would make all their worries seem foolish. The family established a routine that would persist for months. Helen would stay in Evelyn's apartment, maintaining it exactly as her daughter had left it, while Robert drove back and forth between the city and the farm, unable to abandon either his livelihood or his search. Evelyn's three older brothers took turns visiting, bringing food and offering support that felt inadequate in the face of such overwhelming uncertainty. Detective Hoffman threw herself into the investigation with the intensity of someone who understood that time was the enemy of truth. She interviewed every employee at the accounting firm, traced Evelyn's movements through bank records and credit card statements, and coordinated with other law enforcement agencies to ensure that hospitals and morgues throughout the region were aware of the missing person case. The search for the mysterious yellow sedan consumed weeks of investigative effort. Every taxi company in the Denver metropolitan area was contacted, their vehicle records examined, their drivers interviewed. The Department of Motor Vehicles provided lists of every registered yellow vehicle in the state, leading to hundreds of conversations with car owners who had no connection to the case beyond their choice of automotive color. Private citizens joined the search with an enthusiasm that both heartened and complicated the official investigation. Volunteers distributed flyers throughout the downtown area and beyond, organized search parties to examine parks and vacant lots, and established a tip hotline that rang constantly with reports of yellow cars and suspicious behavior. Most of these leads proved fruitless, but Detective Hoffman followed each one with the same methodical attention, understanding that the solution might come from the most unexpected source. 3 weeks into the investigation, a breakthrough seemed to emerge when a man named Daniel Foster contacted the police with information about his former roommate. Foster claimed that his roommate, Patrick Sullivan, had been acting strangely in recent weeks and had recently painted his yellow sedan a different color without explanation. Sullivan had also made several cryptic comments about teaching someone a lesson and had been absent from their apartment for several nights around the time of Evelyn's disappearance. The lead generated intense activity among investigators. Sullivan was located and brought in for questioning. His newly painted car was impounded for forensic examination, and search warrants were obtained for his apartment and workplace. For 48 hours, it seemed possible that the case would be resolved quickly and definitively, but Sullivan had an ironclad alibi for the evening in question. He had been working a double shift at a manufacturing plant on the opposite side of the city, with time cards and witness statements that left no room for doubt. The cryptic comments that Foster had reported turned out to be related to Sullivan's plan to confront his ex-girlfriend about unpaid debts, and the car had been repainted simply because Sullivan had grown tired of the color and wanted to improve its resale value. The false lead was devastating to the investigation's momentum and to the hopes of Evelyn's family. Detective Hoffman found herself explaining to Helen Thorne why the promising development had dissolved into nothing, watching the older woman's face as another possibility for answers slipped away. It was a conversation that would haunt the detective for years afterward, a reminder of how hope could become its own form of cruelty when it proved unfounded. As autumn turned to winter, the case began to lose the urgency that had initially driven round-the-clock investigative efforts. Other crimes demanded attention. New missing persons cases required resources, and the trail of evidence in Evelyn's disappearance grew colder with each passing day. Detective Hoffman continued to work the case, but she was increasingly alone in her efforts as colleagues were reassigned to more promising investigations. The media attention that had initially kept Evelyn's story in the public eye gradually faded as well. Local television stations moved on to more recent stories. Newspapers found other mysteries to explore, and the missing person flyers that had once covered downtown bulletin boards were replaced by advertisements for holiday sales and community events. Margaret Silver continued to think about the young woman she had watched enter that yellow car, but as months passed, she began to question her own memories. Had the interaction really seemed as unusual as she remembered? Was it possible that she had observed nothing more than a perfectly normal taxi pickup, transformed into something sinister only by subsequent knowledge of Evelyn's disappearance? Harold Brennan, the security guard who had been the last person to see Evelyn leave the Morrison building, developed a habit of standing by the lobby windows each evening around 7:15, as if expecting her to return and explain her absence. The ritual became so consistent that other building employees began to worry about his mental state. But Brennan found comfort in the routine, feeling that his vigil somehow honored the missing woman's memory. By the spring of 1990, the official investigation had been scaled back to periodic review of any new evidence that might emerge. Detective Hoffman kept the case file on her desk, adding notes whenever she followed up on tips or reconsidered old evidence, but she knew that without fresh leads, the case was effectively stalled. The reality was painful but inescapable. Evelyn Thorne had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. Helen Thorne refused to accept this reality. She maintained her daughter's apartment for another year, paying rent from the family's savings and visiting daily to dust furniture and water plants that had long since died. She organized memorial services and anniversary vigils, established a reward fund that grew through small donations from community members, and wrote letters to law enforcement officials pleading for continued attention to the case. The strain of maintaining hope in the face of overwhelming evidence that Evelyn was gone forever began to affect the entire Thorne family. Robert's farm suffered from his frequent absences and divided attention. The older brothers found themselves caught between supporting their parents' need to keep searching and their own growing acceptance that their sister was likely dead. Family gatherings became exercises in careful conversation, with everyone avoiding topics that might trigger renewed grief or false optimism. Years passed. Detective Hoffman was promoted and transferred to different divisions, though she never closed Evelyn's file and continued to review it periodically even after retirement. Helen Thorne eventually returned to the family farm, but maintained a post office box in Denver, convinced that someone would eventually contact her with information about her daughter's fate. Robert aged visibly, his hair turning white and his shoulders bowing under the weight of unanswered questions. The Denver that Evelyn had known continued to evolve around the mystery of her disappearance. The Morrison building was eventually sold and converted into condominiums. Margaret Silver retired and sold her bookstore to a young couple who had never heard of the missing woman case. Harold Brennan died of a heart attack in 1995, taking with him the image of Evelyn walking through the lobby for the last time. New technologies emerged that might have aided the original investigation. Security cameras became more common, cell phones began to replace landline communications, and computer databases made it easier to track vehicle registrations and driver histories. But these advances came too late to help solve a case that had grown cold in an era when such tools were not yet available. The unofficial taxi network that investigators had discovered during their search for Evelyn's abductor gradually disappeared as legitimate taxi companies expanded their fleets and improved their response times. The economic conditions that had made unlicensed transportation profitable changed, and stricter enforcement made the risks too great for casual operators. Whatever criminal enterprise had claimed Evelyn's life apparently vanished, along with the broader phenomenon that had made it possible. Occasionally, other missing person cases would remind investigators of Evelyn's disappearance. A young woman would vanish under circumstances that seemed similar, generating renewed interest in the old case files and speculation about possible connections. But these parallels invariably proved superficial, and Evelyn's case remained unique in its complete absence of resolution. Mrs. Dorothy Chen, the landlord who had first reported Evelyn missing, moved to Arizona in 1997 to be closer to her own children. She had never rented the upstairs apartment to another young woman, explaining to prospective tenants that she preferred older, more settled individuals. The truth was that she could not bear the thought of another person living in the space where Evelyn had read her books and listened to her radio, where someone had been planning a future that would never arrive. By the turn of the millennium, Evelyn Thorne's disappearance had become part of Denver's urban folklore, a cautionary tale that parents shared with their children about the importance of staying alert and trusting their instincts. True crime enthusiasts would occasionally write articles or forum posts about the case, proposing theories that ranged from plausible to fantastic. But none of these amateur investigations produced new evidence or insights that had escaped professional investigators. Detective Hoffman, enjoying retirement in a small house near the mountains, would sometimes dream about yellow cars and rainy evenings. She had solved hundreds of cases during her career, but Evelyn's disappearance remained the one that got away, the mystery that had defied every investigative technique and logical approach she had ever learned. In quiet moments, she would pull out the old case file and read through witness statements and evidence reports, hoping that fresh eyes might spot some detail that had been overlooked decades earlier. The forensic sciences continued to advance throughout the 2000s and 2010s, offering new possibilities for solving cold cases. DNA analysis became more sophisticated and more accessible, allowing investigators to extract genetic evidence from smaller and more degraded samples. Digital reconstruction techniques could enhance old photographs and security footage, potentially revealing details that had been invisible to earlier investigators. But without physical evidence to analyze or new witness testimony to evaluate, these technological advances offered little hope for the Evelyn Thorne case. The mysterious yellow sedan had never been found, no personal effects had been recovered, and the witnesses who might have seen something significant had either forgotten crucial details over time or had passed away entirely. Helen Thorne died in 2018 at the age of 87, having never learned what had happened to her daughter. Her obituary mentioned her 30-year search for answers and requested that any donations in her memory be made to organizations supporting families of missing persons. Robert had preceded her in death by 5 years, and Evelyn's 3 brothers, now middle-aged men with children and grandchildren of their own, faced the difficult task of deciding what to do with the boxes of files, photographs, and correspondence that their parents had accumulated during their decades-long quest for truth. The case might have remained forever unsolved, relegated to the archives of unsolved mysteries that accumulate in every police department, if not for a routine construction project that began in the spring of 2023. The expansion of Denver's light rail system required extensive excavation in areas that had been undeveloped during the 1980s, and construction crews were carefully supervised by archaeological monitors tasked with preserving any historical artifacts that might be discovered during the digging process. On a Tuesday morning in April, heavy machinery working near what had once been the outskirts of the city struck something that was clearly not natural stone or soil. Work stopped immediately as protocol required, and the archaeological team was called in to examine what appeared to be artificial materials buried approximately 6 feet below the current ground level. What they found was the rusted frame of an automobile, so deteriorated that its original color was impossible to determine. The vehicle had been buried deliberately, covered with soil and debris, in a way that suggested someone had wanted to ensure it would never be found. Time and groundwater had destroyed most of the organic materials, but metal components and synthetic fabrics had survived in various states of preservation. The discovery triggered a careful excavation process that took several days to complete. As the vehicle was slowly revealed, investigators found evidence that it had once been a sedan manufactured in the mid-1980s. More significantly, they discovered personal items that had somehow survived the decades underground. A brown leather purse, its contents mostly destroyed but its basic structure intact, and the corroded remains of what appeared to be a canvas bag. The purse contained fragments of identification that were barely legible after 34 years in the ground. But advanced imaging techniques, applied by forensic specialists who brought equipment that would have seemed like science fiction to Detective Hoffman's generation, were able to enhance and reconstruct portions of the damaged materials. The name that emerged from those blurred and fragmented documents was Evelyn Marie Thorne. The news reached the surviving members of the Thorne family on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by a detective who was younger than Evelyn had been when she disappeared. The three brothers, now grandfathers themselves, listened in stunned silence as they learned that their decades-long wait for answers was finally approaching an end. Advanced forensic analysis of the scene would take months to complete, but the discovery had already accomplished something that 34 years of investigation had not. It had provided physical evidence of what had happened to Evelyn Thorne, and tangible proof that the theories and suspicions that had driven the original investigation were grounded in reality. The yellow sedan that Margaret Silver had watched disappear into the rainy night of October 1989 had been found at last, along with the young woman who had trusted it to take her home. The case that had haunted Denver's law enforcement community for more than 3 decades was no longer a missing person investigation. It had become a murder case, and for the first time since that autumn evening, when Evelyn had walked out of the Morrison building, there was reason to believe that justice might still be possible. The discovery of the buried sedan sent ripples through Denver's law enforcement community that reached far beyond the boundaries of a single cold case. Detective Sarah Martinez, who had inherited the responsibility for cold case reviews, found herself thrust into an investigation that connected decades of police work with cutting-edge forensic science. The vehicle that had been hidden beneath 6 feet of earth for 34 years would finally yield the secrets it had kept since that rainy October evening in 1989. The excavation site became a carefully controlled archaeological operation, with forensic specialists working alongside construction crews who had inadvertently solved one of the city's most enduring mysteries. Every fragment recovered from the buried sedan was catalogued and preserved, creating a detailed record of evidence that would have seemed impossible to obtain when Detective Hoffman had first begun her investigation all those years ago. DNA analysis of materials found within the vehicle confirmed what the identification fragments had suggested. Evelyn Thorne had indeed been in that car, and she had never left it alive. But the forensic evidence also revealed something that investigators had not expected to find: genetic material from someone other than Evelyn, preserved in fabric fibers that had somehow survived the decades underground. The DNA profile was run through national databases that had not existed in 1989, systems that contained millions of genetic records from criminals, military personnel, and voluntary contributors. The search process took weeks, but eventually produced a match that stunned everyone involved in the investigation. The genetic material belonged to Marcus Webb, a man who had died in a car accident in 1995, 6 years after Evelyn's disappearance. Webb's criminal history revealed a pattern of behavior that aligned perfectly with the theories that Detective Hoffman had developed during her original investigation. He had been arrested multiple times for theft and fraud, including several incidents involving the impersonation of service workers and taxi drivers. His method was always the same. He would monitor legitimate service calls, arrive before the official providers, and collect payment for services he was not authorized to perform. In most cases, Webb's crimes had been relatively minor, resulting in fines and brief jail sentences that did little to discourage his continued criminal activity. But investigators now realized that his illegal taxi operation had eventually escalated into something far more serious. Court records showed that Webb had been facing significant financial pressures in the months before Evelyn's disappearance, including gambling debts and threats from creditors who had grown tired of his promises to pay. The investigation into Webb's background revealed that he had been living in a small apartment on the north side of Denver in 1989, in the same industrial area where Robert Hayes had reported seeing a yellow sedan driving erratically on the night of Evelyn's disappearance. Property records showed that Webb had access to a storage facility in that neighborhood, a concrete building that had been demolished in the early 1990s to make way for commercial development. Forensic analysts determined that the burial site where Evelyn's remains had been found was consistent with the timeline of Webb's death in 1995. It appeared that he had kept her body hidden for nearly 6 years, before finally deciding to bury both her and the vehicle in what was then an isolated area far from the city center. The construction that had ultimately led to the discovery had taken place on land that Webb could not have anticipated would ever be developed. The revelation that Evelyn's killer had been dead for nearly 3 decades brought a complex mixture of emotions to those who had spent years hoping for justice. There would be no trial, no opportunity for victim impact statements, no moment of confrontation between the criminal and those whose lives he had shattered. Instead, there was only the cold comfort of knowing that Marcus Webb had never had the chance to harm anyone else after 1995. Detective Martinez worked closely with retired Detective Hoffman to piece together the full story of what had happened on that October evening. The evidence suggested that Webb had been monitoring taxi company radio frequencies when he heard the dispatch for Evelyn's pickup at the Morrison building. He had arrived first, presenting himself as her driver and gaining her trust through the simple expedient of knowing her name and destination. What had begun as another routine theft had apparently escalated when Evelyn realized that something was wrong. Perhaps she had noticed that the car lacked proper taxi markings, or that Webb was unfamiliar with the most direct route to her apartment. Her accounting background had trained her to notice discrepancies and ask questions, traits that had served her well in her professional life but had ultimately led to tragedy. The evidence suggested that Webb had panicked when confronted with Evelyn's suspicions, leading to a struggle that had ended with her death. Faced with the consequences of what he had done, Webb had apparently hidden her body and the vehicle, continuing his illegal taxi operation while living with the knowledge of his crime for the remaining 6 years of his life. When news of the resolution reached the surviving Thorne brothers, they experienced emotions that they had not expected after so many years of uncertainty. Michael, the eldest, found that learning the truth brought a sense of relief that he had not anticipated. For 34 years, he had wondered if his sister might still be alive somewhere, possibly suffering from amnesia or living under circumstances too terrible to contemplate. Knowing that her death had been swift and that her killer had faced his own mortality provided a form of closure that he had thought would never come. David Thorne, the middle brother, struggled more with the revelation. He had spent decades imagining scenarios where Evelyn might still return, where some explanation might emerge that would restore her to their lives. The finality of her death, combined with the knowledge that justice in any traditional sense was impossible, left him feeling hollow and directionless. The hope that had sustained his family for so long had been both vindicated and rendered meaningless by the passage of time. James, the youngest of the 3 surviving siblings, found himself thinking about his parents and the vigil they had maintained until their deaths. Robert and Helen Thorne had never stopped believing that answers would eventually come, but they had been in their graves for years before those answers finally emerged. The timing felt cruel, as if the universe had waited until it was too late for the resolution to bring comfort to those who had needed it most. The brothers decided to hold a memorial service for Evelyn, something they had never felt able to do while her fate remained unknown. Friends and colleagues who had known her in life gathered at a small church near the family farm, sharing memories of a young woman whose life had been cut short just as she was beginning to build the future she had envisioned for herself. Margaret Silver, now in her 80s, attended the service with the assistance of a walker and the accompaniment of her grown daughter. She had lived for over 3 decades with the knowledge that she had been the last person to see Evelyn alive, and the burden of that witness had never entirely lifted from her shoulders. Speaking to the assembled mourners, she described the young woman she remembered browsing the mystery section of her bookstore, always polite and thoughtful. Someone who deserved to be remembered for her life rather than the circumstances of her death. Harold Brennan's widow represented her late husband at the service, carrying with her the logbook he had kept during his years as a security guard. In the margins of entries from late 1989 and early 1990, she had found notes he had made about the missing woman case, evidence of how deeply Evelyn's disappearance had affected him. His nightly vigil at the lobby windows had been his way of honoring her memory, and his widow wanted the Thorne family to know that their daughter had not been forgotten, even by someone who had known her only in passing. Detective Hoffman, now in her 70s but still sharp and engaged, spoke about the investigation that had defined much of her career. She acknowledged the frustration of never having been able to solve the case while it might have made a difference, but emphasized that police work was often about planting seeds that might not bear fruit for decades. The techniques and databases that had ultimately identified Marcus Webb as Evelyn's killer had not existed in 1989, she reminded the gathering, but the careful documentation of evidence and witness testimony had made the eventual resolution possible. The memorial service became something more than a goodbye to Evelyn Thorne. It evolved into a recognition of how her case had affected an entire community, bringing together people who might never have met under other circumstances, but who had all been touched by the mystery of her disappearance. The taxi drivers who had been interviewed during the original investigation, the volunteers who had distributed flyers and organized search parties, the journalists who had kept her story alive in the public consciousness, all found themselves connected by their shared investment in seeking truth and justice. In the months that followed the resolution of the case, Detective Martinez worked with victim advocacy groups to establish new protocols for missing person investigations. Evelyn's case had highlighted the vulnerabilities that existed in transportation systems, particularly for young women traveling alone at night. The lessons learned from her disappearance led to improved coordination between taxi companies and law enforcement, better training for dispatchers, and more robust identification systems for legitimate transportation providers. The site where Evelyn's remains had been found was eventually developed into a small park with a memorial garden that honored not just her memory, but the memories of all missing persons whose cases remained unsolved. The garden featured plants that bloomed in different seasons, ensuring that color and life would be present year-round as a symbol of hope for families still waiting for answers. David Thorne found himself drawn to volunteer work with families of missing persons, using his own experience to provide support and guidance to others facing the unique challenges of living with uncertainty. He discovered that the empathy born from his family's long ordeal could be transformed into a force for helping others navigate similar struggles. The work gave him a sense of purpose that he had lost when Evelyn disappeared, and it provided a way to honor his sister's memory through service to others. Michael Thorne established a scholarship fund in Evelyn's name, providing financial assistance to young women from rural communities who wanted to pursue careers in business and accounting. The fund grew over time through donations from community members who remembered the case and wanted to contribute to something positive emerging from tragedy. Each year, the scholarship recipients were told about Evelyn's story, ensuring that her ambitions and dreams would continue to inspire others, even though her own future had been cut short. James Thorne struggled the longest with finding a constructive way to process his grief and anger. The knowledge that Marcus Webb had lived for 6 years after killing his sister, continuing to operate his illegal taxi service and potentially threatening other innocent people, filled him with a rage that seemed impossible to resolve. It was only through counseling and time that he began to understand that justice could take many forms and that the protection of future victims was perhaps more important than the punishment of past perpetrators. The three brothers worked together to donate their parents' collection of case files and correspondence to a university archive specializing in criminal justice research. The materials would be used by students and researchers studying missing person cases, contributing to the development of better investigative techniques and support systems for affected families. Helen Thorne's meticulous record-keeping and Robert's systematic approach to organizing search efforts provided valuable insights into the civilian side of long-term investigations. Detective Martinez continued to work on other cold cases, applying lessons learned from the Thorne investigation to unsolved mysteries that had languished for years in police files. The techniques that had finally identified Marcus Webb as Evelyn's killer proved applicable to other cases where DNA evidence had been preserved but not previously analyzed with modern methods. Several families received long-awaited answers as a result of the renewed attention to cold case investigations that Evelyn's resolution had inspired. The construction crew that had inadvertently discovered the buried sedan was honored at a city ceremony, recognizing their role in solving the case. The workers, most of whom had not even been born when Evelyn disappeared, found themselves moved by the stories of her life and the dedication of those who had never stopped searching for her. Their routine workday had become part of a larger story about the persistence of truth and the unexpected ways in which justice could finally emerge. Margaret Silver lived to see the case resolved, passing away peacefully in her sleep just 2 months after attending Evelyn's memorial service. Her daughter found among her belongings a folder containing every newspaper article that had been written about the missing woman case over the years, along with handwritten notes recording Margaret's memories of that rainy evening in 1989. The folder was donated to the same university archive that housed the Thorne family materials, ensuring that Margaret's crucial eyewitness testimony would be preserved for future researchers. The Morrison building, now converted to condominiums, installed a small plaque in its lobby commemorating Evelyn and acknowledging the role the building had played in Denver's criminal justice history. Current residents were informed about the significance of the location, and many found themselves more aware of their own safety practices as a result of learning about what had happened to a young woman who had simply been trying to get home from work. Years passed, and the immediate intensity of emotions surrounding the case's resolution gradually settled into a more peaceful acceptance of what had been learned and what could never be recovered. The Thorne brothers aged. Their own children grew up hearing stories about the aunt they had never met, and grandchildren who carried Evelyn's middle name continued her family line into a future she had never seen. Detective Hoffman passed away in her sleep at the age of 81, her career remembered not only for the cases she had solved, but for the one that had remained unsolved during her active years, yet had ultimately been resolved through the foundation she had laid. Her funeral was attended by dozens of officers and civilians whose lives had been touched by her dedication to seeking truth and protecting the vulnerable. The Denver that had known Evelyn Thorne continued to evolve and grow, its skyline changing as new buildings rose and old ones were renovated or demolished. The city's transportation systems became more sophisticated and secure, with GPS tracking and digital communication replacing the radio frequencies that Marcus Webb had exploited to prey upon innocent victims. Technology that might have prevented Evelyn's death became commonplace, a silent tribute to the lessons learned from her case. On quiet autumn evenings, when rain began to fall and streetlights flickered to life across the downtown district, longtime residents would sometimes think of the young woman who had walked out of an office building in 1989 and never arrived home. Her story had become part of the city's collective memory, a reminder that ordinary moments could carry extraordinary significance, and that the simple act of calling for help should never require courage. The memorial garden that honored Evelyn and other missing persons became a place where people came not only to remember those who were gone, but to reflect on the fragility and preciousness of the lives they still possessed. Parents brought children to teach them about safety and awareness. Couples met there to appreciate their time together, and solitary visitors found peace among the flowers that bloomed in cycles of renewal and hope. Evelyn Marie Thorne had been 24 years old when she made the decision to call for a taxi on that rainy October evening. She had expected to arrive home safely, to continue building the life she had envisioned for herself, to see her family again, and to experience all the moments that the future held. Those possibilities had been stolen from her by a criminal who had exploited her trust and the systems designed to protect her. But her story had not ended with her death. It had continued through the love of family members who refused to give up hope, through the dedication of investigators who would not let her case be forgotten, through the witness of strangers who remembered what they had seen and understood its importance. It had continued through advances in science and technology that made justice possible even decades after a crime had been committed. Most importantly, it had continued through the lives that were made safer by the lessons learned from her disappearance, through the systems that were improved to prevent similar tragedies, through the memorial that ensured her memory would inspire future generations to value both caution and compassion. The rain that had been falling on the night Evelyn disappeared eventually stopped, as all rain does. The autumn turned to winter, and winter gave way to spring, in the endless cycle of seasons that marks the passage of time and the persistence of hope. In the memorial garden that bore her name, flowers bloomed and faded and bloomed again, carrying forward the simple truth that life continues, that love endures, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, can still find a way to emerge from even the darkest mysteries.